Okay, so let's start on time. So dear Professor Lundberg, dear guests, dear participants of workshop on gender and family in labor markets, let me invite you on behalf of think tank IDEA at CERGE-EI on a public lecture. One of our key goals of CERGE-EI and think tank IDEA is to produce and disseminate public policy research, and each year we invite leading professors from prestigious universities to give talk about topics relevant for our public policy debate. Today I'm proud to welcome Professor Shelly Lundberg from University of California. She will talk about effects of childhood environment on educational outcomes. This topic is particularly relevant here in the Czech Republic, where 50% of couples eventually get divorced, where about 15% of children live in a single-parent household. These children are more likely to live in poverty, and single mothers are much likely to be without formal employment. Before Professor Lundberg's talk, I would like to welcome Anna Lesh from Hungarian Academy of Sciences, who is former student of her, and she will say more about Professor Lundberg's research and career. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So, yes, as Philip said, Shelly Lundberg was my PhD advisor, so I was very excited to get to introduce her today. Shelly is one of the world's leading labor and population economists. According to IDEA's REPEC research rankings, she's in the top 2% of economists in her research area. She is currently a Leonard Broom Professor of Demography at UC Santa Barbara, where she also serves as Associate Director of the Broom Center for Demography. She previously held positions at the University of Pennsylvania and University of Washington, where she was also the Director for Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. She is also a fellow at the IZA Institute of Labor Economics and an adjunct professor at the University of Berlin. What I think is very important to the topic of our workshop, which is funded by the Visegrad Grant, is Shelly currently chairs the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession of the AEA. And she also recently published an article with Jenna Stearns assessing the situation of women in the economics profession and the main barriers they are facing today. In terms of her research, Shelly's focus has been on labor economics, inequality, and economics of the family. Her research on labor economics of the household included studying the labor supply decisions of married couples, how parenthood affects these decisions, and also how the gender of the children affect labor market activity. She has also, with Robert Pollack, developed an important model of inter-household bargaining, the separate spheres model, which had implications for both the marriage market and distributional effects of transfer policies. She has studied the economics of teenage pregnancies, racial differences in both how different policies affect teenage pregnancies and how teenage pregnancies affect the educational and labor market outcomes of individuals. And in earlier work with her husband, Big Starts, she developed a model of statistical discrimination, which highlighted the importance of the prohibition of discrimination. Her recent work has been focusing on sources of educational inequality, as well as gender gaps in education, and this is what we will be hearing some of today. So I hand over to Shelly.
For that nice introduction. And thanks to the organizers of this workshop for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see Prague for the first time. Fascinating to hang out for a couple of days and see more of it. And it's also been a pleasure sitting through this excellent workshop today. It's been really great. And And it's always gratifying to see one's former students doing excellent work and hearing about it. So anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to sort of break with the usual theme of a workshop on gender in the family, and I want to talk for a while about why are the men doing so badly? And so that's what this is about. I guess I need to He's there. Is that the it was powerful. Beg your pardon, I wasn't sufficiently prepared. Okay, well, the first sign is far more women are graduating from college or attending and graduating from college than men. And this is true in many countries. So this is just a graphic of the proportion of the population aged 25 to 34 in a large sample of 64 countries, where the top diamonds are the proportion of women, of young women with a college education. And the bottom circles are the proportion of men. Right? So you can see that in recent data, it's almost universal, this pattern of women being more likely to attain tertiary education. And this is a reversal, a fairly recent reversal of the former education gap. And patterns of college graduation that look like this US data are common across developed and middle income countries as well. So what you can see here is that for men who were born up through about 1960, they were more likely to graduate from college than women were. But in recent years, the growth rate of college education in the US and in many other countries has been far in excess of the growth rate of college attendance and graduation for men. All right, so this new education gender gap is opening up, and it appears to be widening. So why do we care about that? All right, it's still true that women with any given level of education earn substantially less than men in most of these countries as well. All right, so why is it an issue? Well, one thing is that men's education is clearly lagging, right, in many countries during a period where we've seen rising returns to human capital, including years of formal education. All right, so this lag is sort of contributing to the growing economic inequality that we've seen across the world. And in some countries, and the US is a primary example of that, the wages and the labor force participation of less educated men has actually fallen substantially, all right? So their economic prospects have worsened in a fairly serious way. And one reason that there's a lot of policy interest in this, aside from the obvious one, is that universally, marriage rates are strongly associated with male earnings and men's labor market opportunities. And so there's a lot of concern here that this growing gender gap also has implications for trends in family formation and family stability across many countries as well. So what's going on? Well, we're economists, most of us, and so what we have to think about is how does the cost-benefit calculus vary between men and women? And the first thing you might want to look at is, are the benefits to attending and graduating from college higher for women than they are for men? And this is actually a complicated question to answer, because there's lots of possible sources of returns to education, right? Not just your probability of employment and your wages given that you're employed, but we expect to see gains in the marriage market as well, all right? Your access to better educated, higher quality mates might increase when you have more education as well. There also might be benefits to education operating through the investments that you can make in the human capital of your children, right? So if you care about the next generation, you might want to get more education as well. And the literature on this is sort of all over the place. But one sort of fairly recent review of it by Becker and a couple of co-authors has suggested that there's not a lot of solid evidence that the economic returns to education are higher for women than they are for men. For one thing, men still work substantially more hours and have higher rates of labor force participation, and that in itself should sort of increase the potential gains to going to college. There's also, benefits to education through things like mortality rates, and many of those gains are clearly higher for men than they are for women. So as, talking about these studies, people have sort of suggested a number of other possible reasons why returns to education might be greater for women, perhaps as rates of divorce increase, if women still feel that they're going to be primarily responsible for the care of children, that might give them an extra incentive to invest in education. But overall, we're not seeing any sort of clear evidence that this growing education gap is being motivated primarily by a difference in the benefits to education. So instead, we need to look at the costs of education. And here, there have been a number of studies recently that have suggested the essential difference between men and women going to college is that men suffer from a deficit of non-cognitive skills compared to women. And it's certainly true that girls consistently outperform boys in school, and this has been true for a long time. Girls get much higher grades almost everywhere, and the gap in the grades is bigger than the gender gap in achievement tests or IQ tests or anything like that. There's also been a number of studies suggesting that girls at school ages are more self-disciplined than boys, both in terms of sort of some tests on impatience, but also based on teacher reports and kids' self-reports about how good they are at sort of sticking on task and so on. In a study by Dupreet and Jennings, they found that early gaps in sort of social and behavioral skills at the point where boys and girls start formal education are actually sufficient to explain early gaps in achievement tests, grades, and so on. Right? So there's been a real focus in on this behavioral, non-cognitive skill as a potential source of differences in education costs. There's also been consistently large gaps between teacher reports of disruptive behavior, grade repetition. Boys experience more disciplinary interventions in school. Boys are substantially more likely to get suspended from school for misbehavior. Okay? So the notion is that this sort of impulsivity, this lack of focus, this, type of behavioral problems sort of increase the sort of individual cost that boys face in getting into college and given that they start college and graduating from college. And so we've really seen sort of a consensus among economists interested in this question emerging that non-cognitive skills are really at the essence of this issue. And then I saw a new theme starting to emerge, and this is really what I want to focus on here. And this new theme was that what's going on here is that boys are more sensitive in terms of their skill development to adverse environments, right? And this story sort of has its origin in developmental psychology and the notion of individual differences in susceptibility, right? So the story here is that some individuals are just inherently more vulnerable to the negative effects of various kinds of contextual diversity, father absence, poverty, environmental stress, and so on. And those people who are more susceptible to adverse environments should, conversely, be more likely to benefit or benefit more from a supportive environment. So this is the source of sort of well-known gene-environment interactions in outcomes, and sometimes it's expressed as, some people are just naturally orchids, right? They sort of grow beautifully in the perfect environment, but they're very, very vulnerable, and some people are just dandelions. And so what this story is implied to the gender context is girls are dandelions, and boys are orphans. And so the fundamental question here is do different developmental trajectories, which do seem to have their origin in some biological differences, make girls more resilient to disadvantage? All right, and we know that those trajectories do differ. Preschool girls are more mature in their language skills, have better emotional regulation than preschool boys. Anybody who's walked into a preschool can appreciate that. There are the stories that school environments are bad for boys, right? Especially modern school environments where there's not sort of limited opportunities for physical play or physical activity. It's been alleged that is sort of differentially disadvantaging to boys, and that impedes their success in school. And a couple of sociologists, DePreet and Bookman again, point instead to the development of an oppositional culture among boys in school, such that they reject school values as part of developing masculine identity. Right? So all these stories suggest that under adverse circumstances, boys are going to suffer more. Well, that has some really, let me pause for a moment to say that there's been a lot of media attention paid to this idea of excess male vulnerability impeding their educational opportunities. So this is the cover of a fairly recent Economist magazine. And in this article and in many similar articles, there's a lot of attention paid to the weak family ties of working class men and the implications of single motherhood for the next generation. So this article says boys are worse affected by single motherhood than girls, perhaps because they typically grow up without a father as a role model. Right? And there have been a number of articles in the New York Times by sort of various journalists sort of emphasizing this and taking it as given, right, that boys do worse in single-parent households and that boys are differentially adversely affected by poverty or other disadvantage. Well, what did I do? That has some really important implications. It argues that the changes in family structure that we've seen in the US and that Philip says you've seen in the Czech Republic as well may disadvantage boys, right? And may be contributing, and many have argued that it does, that it contributes to this growing educational gender gap. And so, what do we know about that? Well, there have been a number of recent studies done focusing on US data, right, that argue that this is exactly what's happening. There was an omnibus study by David Autor and Melanie Wasserman, sort of summarizing what we know about the limiting the apparent worsening economic opportunities of men with lower levels of education. And they in fact say that it's likely that changing family structure has had an adverse impact on boys because of the lower involvement with fathers that it implies. And the story could be either that boys benefit more from more parental time, or that there are explicit sort of same-sex parent effects on the development of skills. Bertrand and Pan look at the correlation between mother's marital status and mother's age on different effects on school behavior by boys and girls. So what they find is that growing up in a single mother household or in a household with a young mother has larger effects on so-called externalizing behavior in school and on the probability of getting suspended from school on boys than it does on girls. And externalizing behavior is basically disruptive behavior. In a very recent study by Autor and a long set of co-authors looks at Florida education data, administrative data, and finds that mother's education and father absence in particular matter more for boys in explaining absence from school, school suspensions, and that mother's education, and especially whether or not the mother has graduated from college, matters more for boys in explaining measures of kindergarten readiness, and for a small subsample, they actually found effects on high school graduation. Now, the thing to note here is that that last result is the only one where we've actually tied family environment, father absence, parental education to actual educational attainment instead of behavior in school. And so what I've been working on for the last couple of years is trying to sort of close that gap and say, okay, what we need is some data where we can look at both family environment in childhood and look at final educational attainment and see whether there's actually an effect. So that's the missing piece, and what I want to know here is, are these early negative impacts, father absence, family disadvantage more broadly, indicative of boys actually experiencing an adverse impact on their skill development relative to girls? So what we want to know is, to what extent can this excess male vulnerability early in life, which previous studies have been documenting, what effect does that have on explaining the gender gap in education? What effect does it have on other labor market outcomes? And so I'm going to talk to you about two sets of results. One comes from US data using the National Longitudinal Survey of Adolescent to Adult Health. And the other one comes from the entire population of Denmark over a long period of years, administrative registry data, and this study is co-authored with Broom. So, I don't have very many equations in this, but just, simply, what we're interested in is sort of the average difference in outcomes between boys. Let's use father absence as just sort of one indicator of family environment. We can take the average difference in an outcome for boys who have a father present and boys in father absent families, and we can split it into two terms, right? And the first term is the causal effect, right? Is the effect of father absence on boys whom we observe in father absent households. And the second term is selection bias, that the boys who are in father absent households and the boys who are in father present households may have different unobserved characteristics or might have different unobserved maternal characteristics such that they would have done differently in the other family structure than we actually observe them in. So it's very difficult to come up with a causal impact of, let's say, father absence on children broadly because of this selection impact. However, if what you're interested in is the gender difference in the causal effect of father absence, then the observed difference in difference between the outcomes for girls in those two family structures and the outcome for boys in those two family structures can give you an unbiased estimate of the causal effect, as long as father absence isn't differentially correlated with these unobservables in girl households and boy households. Okay? And that's something that we can actually look at. So this leaves us with two possible empirical strategies. One is we can simply run an OLS regression model and estimate the coefficient on an interaction term between a male dummy and measures of family environment. And as long as child gender is independent of the family environment, then that's going to give us a causal estimate. In both of these data sets, it's not likely that sex selection through abortion, for example, is going to be an issue. However, there is evidence that fathers are more likely to stay in a household where they have sons than in a household where they don't have sons. But looking for selection effects on observables, I can't locate any evidence in either study that there is any sort of obvious correlation between whether it's a girl or a boy and whether the father's there. But if we're worried about that, we can, with some data, do a family fixed effects model and compare the outcomes of brothers and sisters within the same family, right? And that has some disadvantages because we end up with a smaller sample, and we can only do that estimate on households who have gender discordant children, so they have at least 2 children. And one might worry that these gender effects might not be generalizable across. They might be related to family size and the gender composition of your siblings, for example. But on the Danish administrative data, we can do it both ways. So this study was done, as I say, on the entire population of Denmark born between 1966 and 1995. The advantages of this data is we can link the parents, we can link each child with their parents and with their siblings. And we use 2 different samples. We use the total population for the OLS models, and we use a sample of full siblings for the family fixed effects model. The measures of family environment that we have are, we can look at mother's and father's education. Do they have a bachelor's degree? Do they have a high school degree? Do they have less than high school? And we can look at family structure at birth. And basically all we have there is, are they married or not married? At later ages, we can break that down into, are they living in a 2-parent household? Are they a biological parent household? Are they living with a step-parent? Or are they living with a single parent? And we've experimented with all those different measures. So you can see what's happened in Denmark with respect to education of men and women is mirroring what we saw earlier with the US data. So this is highest completed education by birth cohort and by gender. The triangle shows that the education of women is lower than that of men until the birth cohorts in the late 1960s. And since then, we've seen this widening gap with women getting substantially more education than men, and the gap still seems to be widening. So what do we have here? Well, we've got some adolescent outcomes, sort of outcomes of children who are still in school, and we've got some adult outcomes. For the teenagers, we have, did you complete grade 9 on time? This is sort of a key metric in the Danish education system because grade 9 is the end of primary and mandatory schooling. Everybody has to take the same set of exams, and so we also have a measure for everyone on grade 9 grade point average from those exams. We can see, we've sort of looked at how is completing grade 9 on time correlated with later outcomes, both educational attainment and labor market outcomes. It's very strongly correlated with those outcomes. We have a diagnosis, whether or not there was a diagnosis for an emotional or behavioral disorder, and we also have a dummy variable for whether the child attended special education. So it's a limited set of variables. It's what we can get in the administrative registries. For adult outcomes, we've got the obvious. We've got highest years of completed education. We've got, do you have a bachelor's degree or more? We have your employment status, and we've got where your earnings fall on the distribution of earnings for your birth cohort and your gender. So we're going to look at all of those things. Okay, so this is just to illustrate a little bit of what this data looks like. This is what is happening to the gender gap in highest completed education by age 31 across cohorts. And you can see sort of back on the left for the late 1960s, early 1970s, the late 1960s birth cohorts, you have a fairly small gap in education between men and women, and it steadily grows through time. What the first diagram shows is how that varies by maternal education, and you can see the gender gap is actually the biggest for children who have, for boys and girls who have a mother with at least a bachelor's education. What you get on the right is how the gender gap in education varies by family structure, and this is consistent with what we find throughout this study, which is the effects of parents' marital status and family structure at age 12 are very limited. we don't get very much impact in the Danish data on educational attainment. So what do we find? Well, if we focus in on these adolescent outcomes, particularly completing grade 9 on time, which we have for all of the cohorts, we do see that evidence of excess male vulnerability to family disadvantage, particularly focusing in on parental education. Right? So it's generally consistent with these US studies. Boys are 9.3 percentage points less likely to finish grade 9 on time than girls, and if they have a father with a bachelor's degree, that reduces the gender gap by between 1.7 and 2.5 percentage points, depending on the exact specifications. So that's a really big reduction in the gender gap in that sort of key outcome. Right, and we get sort of a consistent gender gap in the impacts of parental education on that variable across cohorts as well. So what happens if we look at adult outcomes? Well, this was the surprise. Completely different results. So despite the fact that we saw an adverse impact on boys when we look at their grade 9 outcomes, we find that, on most dimensions, both education and labor market variables, women benefit more from a favorable family environment in childhood than the men do. So we see some sort of same-sex parent-child education effects that might sort of reflect role modeling, so father's education has a bigger impact on boys than on girls. But in general, once we actually look at adult outcomes, we can't find any support for the excess male vulnerability story at all. All right, so here's just sort of one example. This is looking at highest completed education at age 31. The first two columns are the total population, ordinary least squares, and the key variables are these interaction terms between the male dummy and mother's and father's education. And so what you can see is that that interaction term is negative when we're looking at mother's education. So mother's education has a stronger impact on girls' education than on boys. I'm sorry, yeah. And father's education goes the other way, right? So mother's education widens the gender gap, and father's education shrinks it but by much less. And the results are very consistent across both the OLS and the family fixed effects results. So there's no evidence here either of any kind of differential selection biasing the results. How about if we look at labor market outcomes? Well, you get a fairly consistent story. The gender gap in employment and earnings is smaller in families with better educated parents. So girls benefit more in terms of their employment probabilities and their earnings from having better educated mothers and fathers. And so once again, we're not finding any evidence that these adverse impacts on boys that we can observe in school have long-term implications for their eventual adult economic status. All right, so the conclusions from the Danish data is basically we're sort of confirming the US results that yes, it does look like family disadvantage has a worse impact on boys when they're in school, affecting their sort of achievement at school. And in this data, we find very strong impacts of parental education, but less in terms of family structure. But no evidence at all of excess male vulnerability once we look at the adult outcomes, which presumably is what we care about in terms of men and women's long-term economic prospects. So we find paternal education in particular reduces the gender gap in education, but it's smaller than the impact of mother's education. So we can do different things with the US data, right? It's a smaller sample, we don't have administrative data, but we have sort of a much richer selection of survey data, and so we can sort of look at a set of different outcomes. So this is the Ad Health data, which I've been using a lot lately. It's a school-based longitudinal study of a nationally representative sample of students. So these kids were in grades 7 through 12, so they were basically age 12 through 17 in the mid-1990s. The data on adult outcomes is going to come from wave 4 of the data, where they were 24 to 32 years old. So almost all of them will have finished education. So this is the birth cohorts 1976 to 1984. It's sort of a fairly recent set of cohorts. And here, so we have fairly substantial samples of white non-Hispanic kids, Hispanic kids, and African American kids. The family structure patterns and other family environment variables are really different in these 3 subsamples. So I'm going to start with looking at the white non-Hispanic sample. I did very similar analyses to using the African American sample and find very similar patterns. But we're going to start with these, and I'm going to focus on father absence as a measure of family environment and college graduation as a long-term outcome. With the Danish data, we could look at both fathers and mothers' education because we have fathers and mothers' education for essentially everyone, right? But in the American sample, which is survey-based, there's a very substantial fraction of the data where we simply have no information about the father at all. So we can't systematically look at paternal education. And I focused on college graduation because that's where the big bang is in terms of future earnings prospects. So just looking at the raw data, first of all, I've divided the sample into 3 different family structure groups. So we're focusing on who were you living with in wave 1 when the initial survey was done. You were either living with sort of 2 biological or adoptive parents, or you were living with your mom plus another father figure, stepfather, and so on, or you were living with your mother but with no father figure. And this diagram shows college graduation rates for men and women in these 3 samples, and the 3rd column in each case is the ratio of male college graduates to female college graduates, and they look really similar across those 3 subsamples, and yes, they are not significantly different. Okay, so the prospects for excess male vulnerability are not looking great in this sample as well. But let's actually do the estimates. Once again, we want to focus in on the interaction terms, the sort of male times no father and the male times stepfather. And what you can see is that these are linear probability models. The boys are substantially less likely to graduate from college. Having no father in the household at wave 1 or a stepfather, both have substantial and significant negative associations with college graduation for both boys and girls. There's no evidence of a differential impact on boys, however, for looking at college graduation. I can also come up with a measure of how long has the dad been gone. You know, there's a measure of have you been living with your biological father since you were age 5, and so we can divide up no father into no father recently or no father always, and once again, there's no, the longer your father's been gone, the stronger is the negative association with college graduation, but once again, there's no significant interaction terms. And this is just, you can beat this data to death, and you cannot find any differential impact on boys. And so this is divided up into 3 subsamples based on mother's education. Look at if your mother has a high school education or less. Does your mother have some college, which is an enormous sample in the US? Is your mother a college grad? The same, there's no interaction between father presence and child gender. Let's just look at high school graduation. Otto et al. Found a relationship between some measures of family disadvantage and high school graduation. I can't find any in this sample. There's no nothing significant going on there. So I grabbed the NLSY 79, National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. It's a very similar set of birth cohorts that we can once again follow over time, and just reran these models in a sort of preliminary way, and we get the same estimates from this alternative sample. Father absence is strongly associated with dropping out or not attending college, but there's no worse effect on boys than on girls. So the question arises, what's going on here? Why did we think father absence was particularly a problem for boys? And the answer is that the previous studies focused on behavioral outcomes for school children, right? With the inference being made that if father absence has a stronger impact on boys' behavior in school than girls' behavior in school, then that must be because it's hampering their skill development, and so it will have implications for later outcomes. And the fact is that boys behave differently in school than girls do. Boys are more likely to exhibit externalizing behavior, and girls are more likely to exhibit internalizing behavior, depression, and other isolation outcomes. And so we might need to look a little bit more carefully at what's going on to school children and what implications does that have for adult outcomes. So I've got lots of potential adolescent outcomes in ad health, lots and lots. And so what I did to be parsimonious is I've constructed an index of school problems. And this is just doing factor analysis on measures of unexcused absences from school, were you ever suspended from school, and then a bunch of self-reported indicators of, do you have problems getting along with teachers? Do you have trouble getting along with other students? Do you have trouble paying attention in school? Do you have trouble getting your homework done? Right? Then the ad health includes sort of a very standard depression index, the kinds that psychologists have developed and validated over the years. It's got, I think, 17 pieces to it. It includes questions about whether you've been feeling hopeful, depressed, happy, lonely, sad, and so on. We've got the kids' self-reported grades in English, their self-reported grades in math, and we've got a measure that I've been focusing more on recently on educational aspirations. So the kids are asked to answer how much they want to attend college, and they answer in a sort of 1 to 5 scale. And how likely do they think it is that they're going to attend college? And they just turn out to be sort of interesting measures. So what effect does father absence have on these adolescent outcomes? Well, here you start to see something. So an interaction between male and having no father in the household has a significant and substantial positive effect on the school problems index, right? So boys without a father in the household are more likely to have problems in school, and the difference between a father present and a father absent household is bigger for boys than it is for girls. However, here we find that the interaction term male and other father has a significant and big negative impact on the depression index, right? So the impact of a stepfather household on girls' depression is bigger than the impact of a stepfather on depression for boys. In both cases, it's positive, right? But it's bigger for girls than it is for boys. And so once again, we're seeing sort of differences in the marginal behavioral responses of boys and girls, with boys being more likely to act out in response to diminished parental time, stress, limited resources, and so on, and girls being more likely to exhibit this internalizing behavior. I don't find any significant interaction effects for grades, but you do see a substantial interaction term in boys' reports that they want to attend college. So boys are more likely to reduce their desire to attend college when they don't have a father in the household. So here's just one example of the kind of pattern we have. So as an alternative to father absence, I have a school quality index constructed from responses of the school administrator is given a survey. And so this school problems index is kind of the qualifications of the teachers, the fraction of the high school class that tends to go on to college, sort of a whole battery of sort of standard school quality indicators. And what you can see is that school quality does seem to have a bigger marginal impact on behavioral outcomes for adolescent boys. So the boys in lousy schools are more likely to get suspended from school relative to girls, and it also has a bigger impact on their reports of wanting to attend college and expecting to attend college. So then what happens if we look at actually attending college? What effect does school quality have on boys and girls? The interaction effect goes away. Right? So school quality, once again, just like father absence, has these bigger marginal impacts on boys' outcomes in school, right? But they just fade away once we look at your actual educational attainment. So what's going on here? Once again, boys and girls behave differently at school. Why is this? Well, it's almost certainly the result of several different factors. One is that the early differences might, to some extent, be driven by these biological differences in developmental trajectories. But later on, clearly, there's strong impacts of behavioral gender norms, right? Or gender identities that place strong pressures on girls to behave in a particular way in school and boys to behave in a particular way in school, right? And I think that these gender norms are incredibly powerful, and they're partly what generates these different responses that we see in the data. So the outcome here is, although previous studies have tended to look at school outcomes like suspensions, disciplinary interventions, externalizing behavior that are really representative of sort of male, teenager, and child responses to adverse family circumstances. But when you've got some rich data, it's not too difficult to come up with measures that show that girls are more vulnerable to family disadvantage. You just have to look at a different set of outcomes. All right, so what we're seeing here, I think, are sort of gender-specific manifestations of the impact of stress, poor care, limited resources on the behavior of boys and girls. And I think there's a lot more studies coming, sort of fleshing out this basic notion. So what I think is going on is that school behaviors we had been assuming were good proxies for underlying skills. And we interpreted the sort of different behaviors of boys and girls in school as being a direct reflection of a gender gap in their skills. And I think the answer is that school behaviors are choices, right? And they depend to some extent on your skills, on your level of self-control, right? But they also depend on the constraints, as choices always do, and that boys and girls are facing different constraints. Right? And I think when we're comparing behavior across groups, we have to keep that in mind. So I think what had been going on with the previous studies, I always don't pay any attention to the equation because, as usual, PowerPoint has eliminated my subscripts. It does that every time. So what's going on here is that there was a thought that there were differential effects of family environment on boys and girls' behavior because there were gender-specific effects on skill development, and that those skills that were developed in childhood had direct effects on adult behavior. And I think instead what's going on is that family environment does affect skills, but mapping skills into behavior requires that we consider gender explicitly. All right, so the way that skills map into behavior is fundamentally dependent on gender and the constraints that gender places on behavior. So in many situations, and I think we've clearly seen some of them, behaviors are misleading proxies for skills. So why is the gender gap in education increasing? I've been obsessed with this question for the last 6 months, and I don't have a good answer for it yet. One story you can tell is that, look, girls have been more likely to graduate from college for a very long time, not college, high school for a very long time. All right, so we've seen sort of lots of data on girls' superiority in formal education for a long time. And this seems to be coming out of early gender gaps in self-control, gender gaps in social skills, which are probably driven partly by biology, but also partly by parental and peer training and expectations. And what we've seen maybe is now that the barriers to tertiary education and the professions that tertiary education gives you access to have finally fallen around the world, all right? This is the predictable result, perhaps, that sort of the female superiority in high school and elementary school is just extending out into this new open access of tertiary education as well. But the key thing that I want to say is that I can't find any evidence that changing family structures, right, are playing any role in that at all, right? So I don't know exactly what's going on. Whoops, did it again. But I'm pretty sure that single moms are not the problem for boys falling behind girls in school. So how long do I have? A couple minutes? I have a couple minutes. So where this leaves me, and now I'm going to sort of delve into what I'm currently embroiled in, is it's left me really skeptical about the focus on skills in economic discussions of the educational gender gap more broadly. And I've been trying to, use ad health data more broadly to look at, can I explain this gender gap rather than just focusing on the differential role of father absence. And I cannot explain the gender gap in the probability that the kids in ad health transition into college on the basis of any arguably exogenous variables in wave one. So I've got measures of cognitive skills, I've got some psychological measures, I've got extensive variables on the parent's relationship with the kid, reported by both the parent and the child. I've got an enormous battery of variables, and I can't explain it. Those educational aspirations, sort of the kids' reports of whether they want to attend college and do they expect to attend college, do seem to play a really independent effect. So there's a large gender gap that's present in both relatively advantaged households and relatively disadvantaged households. Girls are much more likely to say that they want to expect to go to college and they expect to, and that has sort of a very powerful predictive influence on actually attending and graduating from college. And so we already know that there's an adolescent process for girls such that they lose confidence in their math ability, and the gender gap in math grades and math test scores widens between the ages of 13 and 17. All right, and many people have attributed that to gender identity issues, right? Is that as you go through adolescence as a girl, you develop the expectation that math is not for you, right? And there are social pressures that lead you to lose confidence and lose interest in math. So I have a suspicion that there's also an adolescent process for boys. And this is consistent with the story that the sociologists Dupree and Bookman have been telling, that as boys socialize in junior high and in high school, their sense of masculinity, right, the development of a masculine identity, involves for many of them developing this adverse attitude to school. And that what we're seeing in boys' increasing disadvantage in attaining tertiary education is sort of a gender identity issue that's analogous to what goes on in girls' disadvantage in STEM and in math more broadly. But I don't have results on that yet. So thanks very much.